Hello, I'm Barbara Serra. You're watching a special edition of The Listening Post. We're focusing on the media in Latin America this week. Some of our most compelling stories this year came from there, and we're turning the spotlight on three countries in particular: Argentina, Mexico, and Venezuela. Three very different media battlegrounds, all in the same continent. We'll start in Argentina. You'd be hard-pressed to find a more open, overt power struggle than the one taking place there between President Cristina Kirchner and the Clarín Group. Clarín is Argentina's biggest media player by far. The question is, for how long? In 2009, the Kirchner government pushed through a media reform law that was as contentious as it was comprehensive. The law is designed to break up media conglomerates, and the target of the legislation was clearly Clarín. The media group took the government to court over the constitutionality of the law, and that legal battle has dragged on for the past 3 years. President Kirchner's supporters say media reform in the country is long overdue. Her critics claim freedom of the press is crumbling. The Listening Post's Marcela Pizarro now on the legal showdown in Argentina between the government and the country's most powerful media group.
She's been in power for 5 years, and in that time, she's given around the same number of news conferences. It's not that she doesn't have plenty to say. It's just that she doesn't want to say it to the media.
President Kirchner is obsessed with the media. She feels that she needs to control everything, and including the media.
President Kirchner thinks journalism is a kind of social distortion. She sees journalists as the enemy, and she's convinced journalism represents evil interests.
The question is not why does Kirchner avoid the media. The question is, how do we get out of a situation in which the media have so much political power? Kirchner knows that the dominant media represents the interests of the private corporate sector, and she's simply trying to change this dynamic.
To do that, the president has gone after the most powerful media conglomerate in the country. Clarín controls a whopping 50% of the country's newspaper and magazine circulation, one of the biggest TV networks in the region, as well as radio stations and internet providers. Clarín was once a government ally, but in 2008, the group turned against Kirchner when the government tried raising taxes on landowners. Allegiances ended, battle lines were drawn. Those battle lines ran through sports when the government urged Argentina's football league to break its contract with the Clarín-owned cable channel, which it did. They also ran through Clarín's internet provider license, which the government got cancelled. And they ran through Argentina's only newsprint manufacturer, partly owned by Clarín, when the government passed a law to tighten control of it. And then in 2009, Kirchner upped the stakes significantly. Her government pushed through a comprehensive legislation designed to permanently reform the media. The new law ruled that the media pie in Argentina should be sliced up into 3 parts. 1/3 owned by the government, 1/3 owned by private sector companies like Clarín, and 1/3 owned by non-governmental community organizations.
People say, well, yes, we all agree. We don't want the media to be in the hands of a monopoly. But in fact, many people started saying it's not to widen access to ownership that is the real reason behind the law, but simply to dismantle the power of the Clarín Group.
What is so good about the media law in Argentina is that it doesn't control content. It accepts pluralism as well as being anti-monopolist. It confronts power, but it also gives others a voice. Because our society knows that to fight for the media law is to fight for the liberation of the word from the hands of groups like Clarín.
But Clarín isn't going without a fight. December the 7th this year was meant to be D-Day, when the company would be forced to divest up to 10% of its assets. Its cable licenses alone would have been slashed from 168 to just 24. But Clarín won a last-minute ruling and turned the tables on the government. The deadline was extended, and in January, the courts will rule on the legality of Kirchner's law. This new law is just one way Kirchner has tried to undercut dominant media. Another is through cadenas, party political broadcasts similar to those used by other populist presidents in Ecuador and Venezuela, to take her message beyond mainstream media and straight into Argentine living rooms.
400 tapas, 800 noticieros, pero la realidad finalmente pesa y cae.
No queda otro camino que plantear.
The government uses cadenas to get around the dominant media, who have historically been the mediators of the official word, and used it to serve their own interests. So the government is trying to reformulate its communication strategy to reach a society which receives a distorted reality from the mainstream media on a daily basis.
The problem is that talking directly to the public leaves them little choice but to applaud or to leave. It's a bit of an authoritarian way of communicating, and people are just forced to listen. And so journalists are important because they're there to ask things that the public can't ask directly.
It's that public that's caught in the middle of this media war. One of the big issues is the coverage of the economy. Most Argentines are old enough to remember the bad old days, the hyperinflation of the late 80s, the economic crisis of 2001. So it's in the Argentine DNA to fear a run on the banks, and the government says irresponsible financial reporting could provoke one. Last year, Kirchner pushed through a law that threatens journalists with jail time for sensationalist economic reporting. There was nothing subtle about the law. It's called La Ley Antiterrorista, the anti-terrorism law.
People are only reporting what they believe to be the truth or reality. If somebody decides that something they published was the cause for a run on deposits, they could be then accused under the anti-terrorist law. That is very frightening.
El Grupo Clarín
Clarín has absolute command of the media sphere and has the power to incite crises. At the moment, the government is restricting people from withdrawing dollars from the banks. It's a policy aimed at keeping the economy stable. But by publishing front-page stories about a potential dollar crisis, Clarín has the power to create a self-fulfilling prophecy.
y con intereses concretos de generar una crisis económica.
The media have been fighting back, and leading the charge is Jorge Lanata, one of Argentina's most famous and most opinionated journalists. Recently, he invited 200 reporters onto the set of his show Periodismo para Todos, Journalism for All, as part of a campaign for more access to public information.
Kirchner's crusade against journalists is part of a basic concept in Latin America which is known as 21st century socialism. Hugo Chavez has created something similar. They think that journalism always represents the interests of the oligarchy and that those interests are always economic. This is a very stereotyped idea of the media. No one who has ever worked in the media could think that there's just one voice. It's impossible.
But the fact remains that in a country with no political opposition to speak of, Clarín is the media empire that wields the most political influence from the right. So far, Clarín has more time to fight its corner in a battle that's all about democracy or about freedom of expression, depending on who you believe and which side you're on.
The drugs war in Mexico has become one of the most dangerous stories in the world to cover. More than 60,000 lives have been lost, and journalists are among some of the first in the firing line. This year alone, at least 27 media professionals have been killed. News outlets have been bombed, self-censorship abounds, and even those who thought social media might be a safer way to report have died in their attempts to fill the information vacuum. Now, we at The Listening Post collaborated with our colleagues at the documentary program Witness to bring you the story of a photographer, Ernesto Martinez, working in the western state of Sinaloa. Filmmakers Rick Rowley and John Gibler filmed Martinez for 2 days, and their report chronicles the risks that some journalists are prepared to take to report what has become one of the deadliest beats.
Los reporteros ya no acuden solos a los hechos violentos, sino en grupo. Se van avisando, como hormigas en fila india, que hubo un operativo allá, que mataron a alguien, un enfrentamiento, una balacera. El reportero la piensa: me quiero ir de aquí porque ya no se puede trabajar, mucho menos vivir. Si no me voy, si no me llevo a mi familia a otro lugar, un día me voy a arrepentir. Van a matar a uno de nosotros, un familiar, un reportero, y entonces será tarde. Postrarse, hacer malabares o de plano dejar de reportear, guardar silencio frente al narco y su presencia criminal. Esa es la cobertura del narco entre periodistas de medios impresos y electrónicos en regiones como Culiacán, Ciudad Juárez, algunas zonas de Michoacán, Nuevo León, Coahuila y Tamaulipas.
Yo no lo elegí, yo me hice periodista por accidente, como dicen. Yo estaba en el área de intercalación, yo nomás tenía primero y secundaria. Entonces compré, me acuerdo, una camarita, una Jazeera, no, vieja, la cámara es del 60 y tantos. Listo. Lo que a mí me ayudó a entrar ahí fue la huevonada de otro compañero. Porque ese compañero era el guardia de la policíaca, él era el fotógrafo de guardia de la policíaca, pero él salía a comer a las 2 de la tarde y volvía a las 6 de la tarde. Pero en esas 4 horas era invisible. Los de la policía que dijeron, pues vamos dándole chance a este chaval, ese que quiere entrar, y si no le salen la foto, pues ni modo, de todos modos no tenemos fotógrafos, ¿no? Nada se pierde. Y si le salen fotos, pues es ganancia. Yo entraba a las 2 de la tarde y salía a las 7 de la noche, pero para entrar a lo que es intercalación. En todo ese tiempo yo trabajé aprendiendo nomás, no me pagaban ni un 5, yo nomás estaba aprendiendo.
Lo que hacen es poder responderse y al día siguiente esa autoridad
Adelante.
que lo hicieron para no provocar más bajas.
¿Pero van haciendo 10 con ella o qué 36? 18, 31, 10 al 19. Es una mujer. Es una mujer. Van por ella. Va a la ambulancia menos por ella. Jefe, una mujer. 5B. Hey. Cámara. Castelo. Castelo. Urquices. Urquides. Dale, morro. Vámonos. Por favor. ¿Tu mamá? Pásamela. Adelante. Castelo, Castelo.
Estas balas no creo que son de adentro hacia afuera.
¿Qué pasa, oiga? ¿Cómo estás? No, ando trabajando ahorita, hija. Salió una mujer baleada y voy al regreso al periódico y hago la nota y a ver qué onda. ¿Cómo están todos? Bueno, no, todo tranquilo. ¿Los niños ya los metiste?
Que vas a morir, se te queda.
Ya está. Dios le bendiga. Amén.
A este güey, al camarógrafo, a este güey.
Estoy difuminando los rostros de los paramédicos por seguridad de ellos. Nosotros hemos decidido, ¿no?, que como ellos están siempre en el lugar auxiliando a las víctimas, de esa manera los protegemos nosotros. Échalo bien finito. Bien finito. Él es el que le gusta más la cocina. Procuro comer con mis hijos. No me gusta meterme mucho en la rutina de lo que es el trabajo. Me gusta pensar en otras cosas porque se enferma uno, ¿no? de ver tanta cosa negativa. Todos dicen ellos que quieren ser periodistas, pero yo les digo que no, que es un trabajo muy esclavizado, muy estresante, muy peligroso. Y la verdad no me gustaría que ellos llegaran a ser lo que soy yo. Si tuviera yo la oportunidad de irme a residir a otra parte del mundo, sí me iría. Sí me iría para que mis hijos crecieran en otra sociedad, en otro ambiente. Esta sociedad ya está muy enferma. Ya esta sociedad no se recupera tan fácilmente de este trauma social. Mis hijos crecen aquí, a lo mejor indirectamente o directamente algún día están involucrados en un hecho. Es la realidad. La realidad es eso. Estamos en un lugar muy vulnerable, que es esta ciudad.
Yo siempre le he dicho a él que el trabajo que él tiene es muy peligroso. Pues le digo, pues ni modo. Lo único que le digo que pues que Dios lo proteja, que Dios lo cuide siempre.
¿Dónde se ve el chaleco?
Ya dijo todo. Dios lo bendiga.
Buenas. ¿Ya lo subieron? Todos los días es lo mismo, uno cae en la rutina, lo mismo. Los mismos muertos, nomás que con nombres distintos. Casi las mismas escenas.
South American news channel Telesur first went on the air in 2005. Like other relatively new international news channels, such as Russia's RT, Iran's Press TV, China's CCTV, and France 24, Telesur is government-backed. Inspired by Venezuela's President Hugo Chavez and jointly funded by other left-wing governments in the region, the channel was designed to provide an alternative to Latin America's privately owned media conglomerates, the bulk of which lean to the political right. Now, depending on who is writing the reviews, Telesur is either a pioneering and much-needed media voice or a mere propaganda tool for Chavez and his political allies. The Listening Post's Flo Phillips now on Telesur and whether it's worth watching.
The brainchild of Venezuela's president, Hugo Chavez. Supported by left-wing leaders and governments including Cuba, Bolivia, Ecuador and Argentina. Latin America's pan-regional TV news channel. Telesur. If you wanted to see Latin America's so-called 21st century socialist revolution, this is where it's being televised.
Telesur, la señal informativa de América Latina.
The motto of Telesur itself is, our north is the south. That is to say, the objective is to tell the south about the south by the south itself. That's something that has never been done in the past.
Telesur is the most Latin American channel across the region's media landscape. We offer 24-hour information from all the countries in our region. And that means that Latin Americans have access to a much more accurate way of seeing themselves. 7 years since the start, Telesur continues with its aim, information for integration.
The basic concept of Telesur is great. Latin Americans informing themselves about what is happening in the region without having to pass through the US media lens. It's the alternative to what CNN and other transnational channels do.
So when audiences tune in to Telesur, what they see on their screens is different. Extensive coverage of social movements around Latin America and beyond. Roundtable discussions on the Western world's financial crisis. Documentaries highlighting the plights of the continent's indigenous peoples. And as for news on the region, what you see on Telesur is not what you would see elsewhere on Latin America's mostly privately owned right-wing media. A defining moment for Telesur was the 2009 overthrow of the populist president in Honduras, Manuel Zelaya.
What makes it different is how Telesur has covered each story differently. In Honduras, we showed how the president was taken from his house by force, and we broke the hegemonic discourse of other media outlets. We also had the cameras on when the army attacked the crowds of Zelaya's supporters when they demanded his return. We told the story from the point of view of the people on the ground, unlike the rest of the media.
Having come into being to provide a South American-based alternative to news organizations like CNN Español, Telesur now finds itself at the heart of a media conflict that we here at the Listening Post have reported on extensively. From one end of the continent to the other, left-wing governments in Venezuela, Ecuador, Argentina, Peru are all at odds with the mainstream media in those countries. And most of those media outlets are backed by the political right.
The mainstream media dominates the waves in Latin America. CNN and others, most of the private media tends to identify with the people who are against the left. It's about 6 or 7 companies that control about 80 to 85% of the news.
There's no doubt that big media groups dominate Latin America. But outlets that want to provide a counterweight to that media power need to have solid professional standards and not just rely on left-wing discourse. They need to have high-quality output that actually engages the audience.
However, to engage an audience, you have to find one. Telesur has a distribution problem. It's had trouble making deals with regional cable companies and has even claimed it's a victim of a boycott. In 2008, the channel said it was reaching 3 million homes by cable. But that's about a quarter of CNN Español's audience. There are also questions about funding. When the channel launched, governments around the region pledged money. But ask Telesur who funds the channel today, and the story gets murky. Which only goes to reinforce the notion that Telesur is Tele Chávez in disguise. Then there is the issue of editorial balance and credibility.
I
don't think it's balanced at all. It's the same as all the other propaganda projects Chávez has. It would be marvelous if Telesur could be the voice of all Latin Americans. But it's not. It's just one voice.
The channel is very biased on certain issues in Latin America, and I think that's reduced its credibility. Telesur has ended up being a niche reference for the left. But it's not managed to transcend this and become a key information supplier for the region.
There is little doubt that the channel reflects the Venezuelan government's own politics, and sometimes its foreign policy. During the Arab Spring, if Gaddafi and Assad were looking for positive coverage, they found it on Telesur.
We broadcast live out of Green Square in Tripoli and show that it had not been bombarded by Gaddafi, contrary to other news reports. We were in Egypt, Tunisia, in Libya, where we had coverage which broke the dominant discourse of Latin American media, but also media worldwide.
Venezuela's own foreign policies have been reflected in Telesur's coverage of the Arab Spring. Coverage has been benevolent with some dictatorships, like the case of Libya, and while the rest of the world has condemned the killings in Syria, the Venezuelan government is sending Assad fuel, and I think Telesur's coverage is just reproducing its government's policy in a slightly more opaque way.
Some viewers are looking for a different perspective on global events.
¿Cuáles son de verdad las causas que provocan que países cercanos como Qatar y Arabia Saudí estén apoyando esta oposición?
But Telesur's coverage on Venezuela itself has left many thinking the channel has lost its way. This year, Chávez ran in the October 7th presidential elections and won his 4th term in power. Telesur's coverage left little doubt about what side the channel was on. In the past few weeks, the story has moved on, and there's been blanket coverage of Chávez's declining health. In a country lacking a successor who can match either Chávez's political or televisual charisma, this is a story that could well shake the very foundations of Venezuela's Bolivarian revolution and the future of Telesur itself.
You've been watching a special edition of The Listening Post on the media in Latin America. Next week, Richard Gisbert will be back with a year-end look at Syria and the reporting of the war there. So join us next time, right here at The Listening Post.